My name is Tomoaki Yamada, and I finished my PhD in the Advanced Research School in Paris in 2022, and I came back to Japan last year. So I'd like to thank for Alessandro and Professor Nico Fongaro. So my title is the development of Paul Ricoeur's living metaphor, La Metaphor Vive, in a dialogue with Tomonobu Imamichi. First of all, I wrote in French, and I translated in English. So today I'd like to talk in English. So introduction, the aim of this presentation is to examine the development of a living metaphor, La Metaphor Vive, in a dialogue with Tomonobu Imamichi in 1986. Tomonobu Imamichi is a famous philosopher, Japanese philosopher, esthetician. The living metaphor, La Metaphor Vive, is defined as the expression. Lively expression is that which expresses existence as alive. L'expression vive est ce qui vit, l'existence vive. Through this dialogue, it is important to show a link to the translation theory published in 1990s on Paul Ricoeur. To begin with, it is necessary to give some background to the development of a living metaphor, background of my research. First of all, the first background concerns the status of a living metaphor. Living metaphor is a key term in his work. The Rule of Metaphor was published in 1975, and in the preface of his principal work, Time and Narrative, I quote the first thing in French. La métaphore et ton LSI sont deux ouvrages jumeaux, parce que l'un après l'autre, ils ont été conçus ensemble. The Rule of Metaphor and Time and Narrative form a pair, published one after the other. These works are conceived together. However, since the 1980s, his remark on metaphor is getting less and less in his work. Now, Ricoeur is widely recognized as a philosopher of time, history, and memory. In fact, Ricoeur's constant interest in the study of the temporal dimension of human existence is expressed in the titles of his work, such as Histoire and Truth, Histoire et Vérité, Time and Narrative, Temps et Récit, and the Memory is History Forgetting, La Mémoire reste à l'oubli. My subject, is to argue that the living metaphor, La Metaphor Vive, is not a minor term on Ricoeur's thought. So it is important to remark its emphasis in his other work. It means works on translation published in 1990s. So since I'd like to focus on, first of all, the dialogue in 1980. The second background concerns the recent Ricoeur studies and the dialogue with Tomonobu Imamichi. After Ricoeur's death in 2005, his family donated his books, works, and other items to the Institut Protestant de Théologie at Paris. And the Ricoeur Archives collection was established in 2009. His published papers, lecture manuscript, conference presentation manuscript, and the draft that form the basis of his work can now be classified systematically. It is true that these archives are only auxiliary, including discussions as a preparation, and do not necessarily replace the main works published before his death. However, they are useful an introduction to exploring various directions through the discussions and some remarks. To explore the various directions, this dialogue with Tomonobu Imamichi is important because this dialogue was first of all recorded in cassette and translated from French to Japanese. The most significant thing is that this was almost improvised dialogue for Ricoeur. Ricoeur is not one to improvise, but he carefully prepares a manuscript for each interview. I heard that the testimony by a famous translator of Paul Ricoeur, Hiroshi Kume, he remarked that this dialogue, because he accompanied Paul Ricoeur to the airport Narita when Ricoeur was invited to Japan, Imamichi asked him some talks with improvisation, and Ricoeur always complained of him in the taxi to the airport. So that is why this dialogue was a little bit ignored long time, even if translated in Japanese. So, a heuristic moment in a dialogue with Tomonobu Imamichi in 1986. Ricoeur made 3 times a visit to Japan in 1977, 1986, and 2000. In his second visit in 1986, he gave a lecture entitled Théorie de l'action, Théorie morale, Theory of Action, and Moral Theory at the International Philosophy Symposium organized by the Taniguchi Foundation in Shiga Prefecture. Prior to this symposium, Ricoeur conducted an interview dialogue with Tomonobu Imamichi in Tokyo on the themes of science, religion, and East and West, and eco-ethics. The discussion focuses on the translation of the word habiter. Habiter means live, inhabit, dwell. Ricoeur clarified this translation as well as a result of the metaphorical system of meanings. Ricoeur started by pointing out the connection between the word eco, derived from Imamichi's research project, Eco-Ethics, and Heidegger's term Wohnen. The notion of eco is defined by Imamichi as the way in which the human inhabits. For Heidegger, Wohnen means to build, to inhabit, and think. This means dwelling and thinking in the self-constructed world. Heidegger also makes a connection between dwelling and habit, between Wohnen and Gewohnheit. In response to Ricoeur's remarks, Imamichi takes an example from the rhetoric of Japanese poetry. Inhabit is pronounced sumu in Japanese. The original meaning of sumu is that of to clarify oneself, sumu, and has the same pronunciation. The 2 meanings are interchanged in the poem. A trickle of water flows quietly without raising a dust. In this poem, water dwells quietly and water becomes clear, transparent, and pure. Imamichi says that if the water continued to clarify, that is to dwell, the water would become purified, and the image of the moon clarified, transparent, pure, would be reflected on the surface of the water. This is an example of Imamichi. And so we would say, he continued, we would say as if we lived perpetually in the temple far from the city on the mountain, we would become a man with a pure heart. This is a quotation by Tomonobu Imamichi. In this example proposed by Imamichi, Ricoeur was interested in the poetic coherence between habit, live, inhabit, dwell, and clarify or purify. He discovered a richness, metaphorical meaning, and a semantic resonance in the Japanese cultural context that does not exist in French. For Ricoeur, is the experience of a difference and a gap between French and Japanese. According to Ricoeur, habiter in French derives from the custom of habiter. It is the habit, the way in which one habitually behaves. In short, the way in which one habitually behaves. In short, it is a hexis in Greek, as a virtue of the permanence of the disposition of the body. That is the word manner of being. But studying it hexis in relation to our habit, it will not be independent of the manner of being, which is the beauty of a character clarified with the virtue of each. An important link between translation and the metaphorical expression is in the dialogue with Imamichi connects the inhabiting portion of the exchange to linguistic hospitality on translation. This is an invariable example of a heuristic moment in an intersection of the metaphorical expression and the translation theory. Second part, I'd like to show the La Métaphore vive in his work published in 1975. Ricoeur's living metaphor is clearly distinguished from the dead metaphor of structural linguistics. Ricoeur takes it as an epiphora of the name at the level of discourse. The metaphor must be taken at the level of discourse is not capable of translating the original word and original meaning, because on the definition of metaphor based on Aristotelian rhetoric, the rhetoric theories of figure or rhetoric established after Aristotle have influenced structural linguistics. Metaphor is a substitution of a noun or word and is classified as a trope. In this logic of substitution, the metaphorically substituted would allow us to translate back to the original word. In this case, the metaphor offers no new information. Ricoeur defines a metaphor in a metaphorical statement as a sentence, énoncé métaphorique. The metaphorical statement has three levels created from the semantic dimension. In each statement, the principle of meaning production, linguistic imagination, and referential function are elaborated. On the basis of three metaphorical statements, metaphor rises from poetic to speculative discourse. First, a metaphorical statement as a principle of meaning production. For Ricoeur, the word always occupies the center of metaphorical meaning. But the process of producing metaphorical meaning consists in the sentence as a contextual locus. With the production of metaphorical meaning lies between the meaning of the word in ordinary use and that in metaphorical use, which is determined by the sentence. The term statement reconciles the incompatibility between word and sentence. In the previous example, man is a wolf, l'homme est un loup. Maybe he is cruel. The relationship between the phrase and sentence, man is, and the word a wolf produce the metaphorical meaning, and the locus of metaphorical meaning production at the level of discourse semantics lies in the metaphorical statement, which is tension between word and phrase, word and sentence. Ricoeur defines the sentence as a unit of discourse and a life of language in action. The second, as a linguistic imagination. Ricoeur emphasizes the productive imagination as an image made by a metaphorical attribution. This second metaphorical statement links between the linguistic and the non-verbal. He also explains the union of meaning and image through the example of ambiguous figures such as a rabbit or a duck. In this example, a thing to say, I see this, as a thing to say, I see this as. Seeing as and imagine relate. There is no rule to imagine between imagine this and see the figure as this, or any system that makes seeing possible for us. Seeing as is therefore the linguistic and the sensory side. In short, the unity of meaning and image. Therefore, seeing as is a sensible aspect of poetic language, half thought, half experience. Seeing as is an intuitive relationship that holds sense and image together. Le voir comme est la face sensible du langage poétique, ni pensée ni expérience. Le voir comme est la relation intuitive qui fait tenir ensemble le sens et l'image. The third point, as a referential function, the referential function is defined at the semantic level. On the example of nature is a tempo, like a Baudelaire, when interpreted literally, natural nature is not a tempo, but according to the metaphorical interpretation, nature is tempo. But traversing the primary meaning, the secondary meaning is provoked. It is the incompatibility of the interpretation made by the primary meaning orients us towards the secondary meaning. So at this point, the incompatibility of two meanings gives rise to a conflict between the interpretation of the literal meaning and the metaphorical meaning. On the basis of this conflict, which is nature is a temple or is not a temple, the meaning of the word is extended. The significance of the metaphorical statement as a tension between the two interpretations unfolds in the referential function of poetic language. In the metaphorical statement, meaning arises from the failure of interpretation in the literal sense. This failure is simply the flip side of semantic innovation. This intersection of literal interpretation is a moment of meaning production. The metaphorical interpretation gives rise to the new referential aim and the new semantic relevance simultaneously on the abolition of the literal interpretation. The conflict between the real and the metaphorically described gives rise to a new referential aim through metaphorical description. These three metaphorical statements provoke a tensional conception of metaphorical truth that rises from poetic to speculative discourse. Ricoeur points out, metaphor is living not only to the extent that it vivifies a constituted language. Metaphor is living by virtue of the fact that it introduces the spark of imagination into a thinking more at the conceptual level. La métaphore est vive en ce qu'elle inscrit et lance l'imagination dans un concept plus au niveau du concept. The living metaphor is not the opposite of dead metaphor in the structural linguistics. The metaphor in structural linguistics is the theory of a substitution between the metaphorical and the literal word. The living or dead word is merely a classification. Lively metaphor consists in the statement, in other words, in the level of discourse through the act of imagination. It rises from poetic discourse to philosophical discourse and gives us food for thought. The metaphorical description teaches us to see reality anew through the act of imagination. The oscillation between the real where we are or where we live and the metaphorically described reality. Real gives us the ability to think about our existence. Metaphorical truth consists in the tension between word and phrase, between literal and metaphorical interpretation, between identity and difference. It is deployed in the theory of spirit reference, followed by the paradox of the copula. In the statement, nature is a temple. The copula, tension between being and not being, is finally signified by being like être comme. Being as is a paradox that includes being and is not, and this tension in the copula teaches us about existence in the real. It's the experience of belonging, appartenance. Poetic discourse is articulated by speculative thought taken to its highest level of reflection of reality. This is a distinction. The living metaphor lies in the dialectic between belonging and distinction, appartenance et la distinction. In poetic discourse, the living metaphor proposes us the truthfulness of meaning, then teaches us how to see the real or of the existence of the real as a quasi-visual, and finally gives us a higher level of thinking. The power of seeing as lies in the discovering a similar in the difference, and in creatively describing reality. Linguistic Hospitality on Translation, published in 1990s. The act of translation is a discovery of a meaning that is appropriate to another culture. In other words, although there is a linguistic difference or gap in meaning, a similar meaning is found in another language and cultural context. The work of translation is thus described by Ricoeur as a search for équivalence without identity, équivalence sans identité. his theory of translation is closely linked to his reflection on cultural plurality in the latter part of his life. In his article, in his interview, point de vue culture de deuil à la traduction, the revised version of a paper at the UNESCO colloquium, interview of 21st century, entretien de 21e siècle, he writes, it is a translation that produces not only exchanges, but also equivalences. The astonishing phenomenon of translation is that it transfers meaning from one language to another, or from one culture to another without giving identity, but only offering equivalence. Translation is this phenomenon of equivalence without identity. But this conception of translation includes a certain ambivalence. Indeed, the work of translation oscillates between the work of memory and that of mourning as loss. Because to translate the word is to create a new word. It's a one moment to create a new word, at the same time to keep old meaning. So he called the work of memory, and we have to forget the old meaning. So he called it like a works of mourning as loss. At the same time, there is no perfect translation. The work of memory does not go without the work of mourning. On the one hand, in our desire to translate, we strive to remain faithful to the original message. This corresponds to the work of memory as a preservation of meaning. On the other hand, the possibility of saying the same thing in a different way points us towards the propensity to betray where we encounter translation difficulties. This is part of loss of a proper meaning that accompanies translation into a foreign language. Yet this renunciation of the ideal translation introduces the joy of linguistic hospitality, where the pleasure of dwelling habité in the other's language is balanced by the pleasure of receiving the foreign word at home in one's own welcoming house. This is a quotation by Ricoeur. The act of translating is a search for similarity and the discovery of new meaning in a foreign language, despite the impossibility of a perfect translation. This act of discovering a surplus of meaning can be considered as the flip side of losing one's own meaning. The act of translating is thus a process of reception into another cultural heritage. The notion of linguistic hospitality places the work of translation under the sign of inhabiting habité. In linguistic hospitality, it is possible to say the same thing in another way by searching the similar among the different languages. To say the same thing in another way is a construction of comparable. So I'd like to go to the conclusion. Following on the formal discussion inhabiting, Ricoeur emphasized the posture of consonance in relation to cultural contingency. By taking this cultural contingency into account, it is possible to investigate what at the margins of Ricoeur's thought offers a glimpse of an encounter with the other in his difference with someone whose thought is outside the culture, language, and tradition to which Ricoeur's work belongs. Cultural contingency is a paradoxical ground for this kind of encounter, at once distinguishing thoughts and enabling their rapprochement. So in dialogue, Tomonobu Imamichi, the theory of the metaphor is maybe it's a background, but I'd like to point out that the metaphor on Ricoeur works as describing describing the world where we are to live, and the translation. Also, linguist hospitality is a moment to discover the word we couldn't translate. Ricoeur was called intraduisible. Intraduisible is a moment of polysemy to innovate other words to translate other translations. That's all for my presentation.
Let's have a very simple question. How do you control metaphors to be sure that they help you to see more and to think at a higher level, rather than simply confuse you or abuse language?
Yeah.
Does the metaphor have its own logic? For example, the language has its grammar, its lexicons, its historical usage. And the person who understands that very well can play with language poetically. But people who don't understand that simply butcher, they massacre language, right? So you gave the example at the beginning of the two meanings of sumu, right? But sumu also means to finish.
Yeah.
But if you put that in there, it would just confuse things. Okay, so in other words, you're selective, you're choosing, and in order to tell a foreigner the homonym, but you're withholding part of the information so they can understand and see more. That's kind of a trick. No? But my main question is, what are the controls of metaphor so this kind of thing doesn't happen?
Yeah, to think about the metaphor, one is important thing is distance. Distance. When I remarked metaphorical truth, one is important is this is a tension. Truth in the tension, the distance is important. If I know whether this sentence, this rhetoric, whether we can, it makes no sense. It makes no sense for me. But tension, the distance is important. That is why I remarked the metaphorical truth as a tensional truth. This is a condition to create the metaphor. Maybe Ricoeur remarks ideal situation on the living metaphor. And at the same time, he didn't remark to he remarked living metaphor 2 or 3 times in his works. Because if he remarked 5 or 3 times, maybe he has a risk that is a living metaphor is a pair of a living metaphor and that metaphor as a classification.
What is the distance? Is there a distance between what and what?
Between the lecturer and the sentence. Okay. The reader and the text. Because in this case, the reception of the metaphor when we read the metaphor, the distance to the text, to the sentence is important.
Thank you. Thank you. It was brilliant. I was thinking because another thinker, and maybe not a thinker, maybe not a philosopher in a traditional sense, but somebody else who is really like stressing the cognitive sense of metaphors is Lakoff. But like something that is missing maybe in Ricoeur, like is still very like hermeneutical, like very linguistic position. For Lakoff, the heuristics. The fact that metaphors can enlighten your senses because they're embodied. So, and actually his position is that he knows him, but like not so much. But his position echoes that a much older one by Vico. So like Vico was really stressing how like for us we are so used to abstract language that we forgot how like all this kind of abstract meaning must arise from the body as a set of interaction between logos and world. And so like the sumo thing would be it's not just living, it's not just to be clear, but the sense of ending. If we put the bodily experience of like being still. So the three things like to be to like something ending, somebody like inhabiting, and water being clear. But we get the metaphor. And stillness is not a metaphor; it's actually a sensory experience. It's an image. So, like in a sense, it's not a great etymology if we connect just the two of them. But if you understand how a senses experiences, I'm at peace. And this thing wouldn't be. And this experience is wordless. But when I have three different meanings gathered in my body and expressed to a word, then I can escape from abstraction through metaphor. So like I think that maybe Ricoeur is missing I don't remember him so well, and I never knew him that deeply. But does he discuss how metaphors are embodied sensuous? It seems that at least in your quotes, he seems very much stressing this double layer of language, but he's not asking himself like if they are connected to this wordless element.
It's a very important point. At this time, I remarked the metaphor in the poetic discourse on Ricoeur, because Ricoeur remarks the metaphor in the two dimensions. First dimension is the poetical meaning. Second dimension is metaphor as a philosophical term. So at this time, I created dialogue with Imamichi as a poetic metaphor. At the same time, if I remark the philosophical metaphor on Paul Ricoeur, he has a discussion with Jacques Derrida on the metaphor. Ricoeur always remarks the necessity of history of philosophy, because to renew the philosophical term as a context, we have to renew the terminology, philosophical terminology in our contemporary situation, to renew in the contemporary situation, because first of all, Ricoeur uses always philosophical term as a recognition to create to renewal. We have to know the history of philosophy and at the same time contemporary situation. That'sからin this case, it's a different from a poetical metaphor in the context, in the discourse, not a discourse, philosophical term, philosophical glossary. The context means history of philosophy. And about the difference with Jacques Derrida, Jacques Derrida's aim is deconstruction in the metaphysics. This is a discussion with Ricoeur and Derrida, but Ricoeur, he aims to the creativity of language. So his aim is creativity of language in the metaphor, but Derrida is metaphysics. So when I read the dialogue, the review for Ricoeur by Derrida cited the metaphor people, but he misunderstood. We encountered in the terms of meta physics, but Ricoeur wrote metaphoric. Encounter metaphoric. This is a misunderstanding Ricoeur in the review Cahiers de Lerne. so this is, I think it's a distinction between the philosophical term, metaphor as a philosophical term and a poetical term. And then, yeah, you remarked George Lakoff. Yeah, I think this is a, I think, yeah, Ricoeur as recognized as one of the recognized well as he remarked the metaphor as a recognition, like the theory of language, and at the same time we can remark the mitate. Mitate is one of the Japanese expression. Some Japanese scholar remarks the similar the theory of metaphor on Ricoeur and mitate. But this is Augustin Berg. He remarks well. But about mitate is two ways. One way is to the only in the level of the poem language. If we think about the waka by Seishun Nagon, she raised the snow on the tree as cherry blossoms. This is a famous waka in the mitate in the language in the poem. At the same time, mitate is for the object or symbol. The famous example is I don't know, you know, the suiseki, the black stone in the bedroom. We can see black stone as a mountain, as a statue of Buddha. Yeah.
The great interest of mitate is that it's a visual metaphor, something that Western art didn't really do until Dada, basically. La Fontaine by Duchamp is maybe is the first view of mitate in Western art. So that's a specific problem of having a metaphor like in the outside world, rather than on a linguistic level. And that's even mitate, I mean, it's with poetry too. But there's a visual specificity of it that, for instance, I don't know if you can use Ricoeur to discuss like image on a level of image, which is non-linguistic.
Ricoeur always remarks linguistic images, not so mitate as a black stone, suiseki, or a bonsai. But at this point is for me is interesting. At this time I couldn't work mitate compare.
Yeah, a question. So can you explain, because I don't know, Ricoeur, actually, what is the role of copula in creating a metaphor?
Copula in metaphor is a recognition, an ontological level, because Ricoeur tried to open for the philosophical discourse from poetic discourse. So copula is existence, but existence of the object or description of the world as it are.
So
we remark so when he remarked copula, the metaphor as a metaphor as a right to say something in the real. This is Ricoeur always against the structural linguistic metaphor. Metaphor doesn't refer anymore to the real.
So if I understand you, so the copula is what give the meaning of existence to the metaphor. Is it correct?
Yeah.
So how can you translate in Japanese the nature is a temple?
自然は神の宮。God's temple in the Baudelaire.
Okay, so there is no copula because Japanese is So is it a metaphor, or what is the meaning of metaphor in Japanese that has no copula?
Because
The saying was different.
sometimes copula is is not expressed in Japan. In Japanese, 自然は神に接する or because です or である。である is invented in the 明治やですである。
Therefore, in Japanese, we could say nature, and I don't know, nature temple.
Yeah,
nature wa temple or nature temple no gotoku.
No gotoku, yeah.
So there is no copula. So is this still a metaphor, or what is in the sense of Ricoeur?
Sense of Ricoeur, no.
Because I remember because today we spoke about Deleuze. I remember. So the interpretation of Deleuze of new realism is that there is a famous scene in a Rossellini movie, I think. A woman walk on the street, they see a factory, and then she said, I saw a prison. And it's not a metaphor for Deleuze, at least. It's like she said, the factory was prison. Is this a metaphor, or what is this?
No, I think Ricoeur didn't categorize the metaphor metonymy like this. Ricoeur always remarks ideal example, subject and predication. S は he である。If he remarked some particular case, maybe his example of metaphor is classified as a metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche. I think Ricoeur treats the metaphor as a phenomenon of attribution in total.
Okay, but so do you think that the theory of metaphor of Ricoeur is usable, applicable to Japanese literature?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so.
In which sense?
I'll say like I always said to listen similar points to Mitate.
That is Mitate linguistic or
Mitate linguistic.
is visual? Right.
I wrote an article in December, so I think I'm fresh and I have my personal take. I don't think it's a general thing. That is a bit complex, I think, because metaphors are not we cannot really talk about metaphors in visual arts in Europe, or like really like not because they're not there, but because they didn't really become like a major trope, as we find in Mitate from Edo, especially. The word Mitate, I mean, it's older. Yeah, you were mentioning Seishonagon. There's a few examples, Makurano Soshi, for sure. But I mean, maybe 1 year ago when we were in a Mushinen reunion, Raquel Pozo was talking about the holographic vision. So for instance, it might be really some influences would be rather Buddhist, especially something like Kegon. So like this realizing that the unity of disparate things, that's the metaphysical background of let's say East Asian take on like see something as. But you were mentioning also like Mitate would be very close to the Wittgenstein seeing as. So I see something as something else.
Yeah.
What's in the back? Oh yeah. Okay. So like Heian ladies would have that blast with the rabbit. And that's so for instance, the ambiguity of Mitate is two-way. Most metaphors on a linguistic level seem to be at least referential. So seem to go from there's one literal sense and one non-literal sense. In the case of Mitate, it's more of a like, let's say, again, quoting Kasuli's holographic overlap. That's a big difference that then we can trace some like metaphysical religious background for that. So it's very interesting to compare them. I could not identify them.
One is important thing is I don't know, seeing as it express at the same time the mood, the feeling, affectivity. Because Ricoeur remarks after 1980s by citing Marcus Hester's Coleridge, I forgot his name, but the metaphor is provoke us the mood. Maybe the mood is one important thing to compare or to talk to remark. Mitate.
Whereas mitate, for instance, is very often for comic effect, which is not something we can really generalize about. So it's all about big, small, high, low. So like very often has a comic effect, and we cannot say that about metaphor. But they do belong, like let's say, in a shared cognitive space. So like I agree, it's a very interesting topic for philosophy of language and philosophy of imagination for sure.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.